Hello everyone, my name is Darla Saunders, and on behalf of the Atlantic Salmon Conservation Foundation and the Canadian Rivers Institute, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. This series is made possible in part thanks to the contributions of the Government of Canada. Today we are thrilled to be hosting Simon Mitchell. Simon is a forester by training and has spent the last 20 years engaging communities to protect some of the region's most unique landscapes. He was recently appointed to the MEC, National Grant Review Committee, and is looking forward to bringing his expertise to the national level to further encourage and support many of the great activities happening across the country. So for those of you who are new to the series, we're going to save questions until the end of the presentation. But for the moment, I'm now going to turn the webinar over to Simon.
Great. Thank you so much, Darla, and wonderful to be with everybody today. I'd like to first start off by thanking the Canadian Rivers Institute and the Atlantic Salmon Conservation Foundation for the opportunity to participate in this webinar, and I'm delighted to be with you today from somewhat foggy and soggy Fredericton. So I've got in front of you is slide deck. Obviously title page is self-explanatory, and folks, you can see here on slide number 2 that my outline for this short presentation. This is really based on my experience over the past 20 years in New Brunswick, and I'm going to cover some theory as well as some practice. The theory, I hope, will help to put some of this work into context and also help you in your situation when it's and projects that you're involved with around community engagement. So fairly straightforward outline. We might as well move to the next step here. I think the broader context for our work in water is around this idea of water governance, and you can see the definition that I've put up on the slide of water governance is the range of political, social, economic, and administrative systems that are in place to develop and manage water resources and the delivery of water services at different levels of society. The concept and idea of water governance has been emerging over the last, I guess, decade or so, and really it refers to the ways in which societies organize themselves to make decisions and take actions that affect water. This is a very different approach than what we would traditionally see with government, the other sort of governance-based model that we're used to. Government, you know, often utilizes a top-down regulatory approach to address water-based issues. Governance, on the other hand, is more bottom-up, community-based, and I think holistic in nature, and that really is the appeal to many people working in the sector. There are a couple of components of success. This stems from research from the Water Policy and Governance Group out of Ontario, tied to water governance and the ability of agencies, organizations, individuals, and others to govern the water system within which they are engaged here. And I put this up because this is going to become a little more relevant as I move through the slide deck here. You're going to see in the 3 case studies that I present some significant differences in how these components are realized at the local level in New Brunswick on transboundary waters. I think a couple of the key components here that you want to take note of are the reference to legitimacy and accountability. Actors' roles and relationships obviously are important and have been key to my ability to engage with communities and others over the years to affect positive change at the watershed level. Just as an aside, when I first started working in this sector, my background was predominantly forestry, and at that time, 20 years ago, the relationship, the people side of forestry was more or less non-existent. You know, trees were managed for some use, and people were never really sort of factored into the equation. That has changed significantly in the forestry sector over the last 20 years, and I think we've intuitively always known it's a big part of the water sector, and for me it's been sort of a real area of growth and something that I've had to recognize that that the people management, the people relationship building side of things is imperative for achieving long-term success, however that that success might be defined. Another key component, adaptation, certainly significant at this point in time in the water field, especially as we address climate change and the impacts associated with that. I'll use some of the language around the components of success as I move through the slide deck here, but certainly keep this as top of mind as I talk about the three case studies, because you'll notice that there are some significant differences in the ability for community groups and others to engage at the watershed level based on these components. Just as another aside, this research from the Water Policy and Governance Group from Georgia Sims and Rob DeLoe is available on their website, and if you've not referred to that website, it's certainly worth checking out. They are doing some fantastic research, and I have a link at the end of this deck to their website. So to put the three case studies into to context, we have a map here of eastern Canada. The area circled in red is the St. Croix River. It forms the boundary between the lower part of New Brunswick and I guess it really is sort of the middle part of Maine as Maine goes down the coast some. The circled area in orange is the Meduxnikeg watershed, and that is a tributary to the St. John. The Meduxnikeg is a transboundary watershed, again, between Maine and New Brunswick, and is almost abuts the top end of the St. Croix. There is one small watershed in there that drains to the St. John. Again, it's the Eel. And the blue line represents the St. John River. I didn't draw a circle around its drainage or rough drainage, but it would take up a good chunk of the map. Portion in Quebec, north of Edmundston to sort of middle of New Brunswick. So if you were to draw a line sort of through the Canada there parallel to the river, that would be the eastern boundary for the St. John, and it obviously drains out to the Bay of Fundy at St. John. So three distinct watersheds, all transboundary, and in the case of the St. John, it covers three jurisdictions: New Brunswick, Quebec, and Maine. My work in this province started some 20 years ago on the St. Croix as part of some research I was involved with, and through various summer jobs and undergraduate research on the St. Croix around Canadian Heritage Rivers designation, and I've subsequently progressed to various positions with groups on the St. John River system and on the Meduxnikeg River system. This is a bit of a crude slide and on the sort of to give you a better understanding of the character of the region for folks that are from away, so to speak. And you can see that there is significant differences between the three watersheds that we will be looking at in a little more detail here shortly. The St. John at 55,000 square kilometers is the largest drainage in the Northeast. A population of 500,000. I note that most of that is rural. Some of it is urban in places like Fredericton, St. John, and small communities that are predominantly at the tributaries of the St. John at the intersection between those tributaries and the main stem. That is a reflection of the historical settlements up and down the St. John. The Maliseet have been in the region for somewhere between 7,500 and 8,500 years. That's very different than the Madaxnikeg, which is predominantly rural, as well as the St. Croix, which is rural, although it does have some development in the form of municipalities in St. Stephen and in Calais, Maine, urban areas at its mouth, more or less, where it drains into the Bay of Fundy. I note that the uses at this point would generally be considered recreational for both the St. Croix and the Madaxnikeg. The St. John has historically and continues today to really be a working river. And I think the last point, formal agreements, this goes back to the components of success from Delow, and that the St. Croix is the only entity out of the three that has a formal management agreement in place for the resource. This started in 1986 and was further strengthened in 1994 with the development of an international management plan. This speaks to the legitimacy of the organizations and the work along that river, and the transparency and accountability and everything else that is brought along with it. So in the case of the Madaxnikeg and St. John, those management agreements or other supporting legislation and regulation are not in place. So they're in a very different situation when it comes to resource management and the authority that local communities can exert with respect to that resource. I should also note just the St. Croix, and if we go back, maybe I'll go back. Here we go. The St. Croix has traditionally been the link for the First Nations in the Northeast. To travel from the St. John River system, you had to portage through the St. Croix to get to the Passamaquoddy, and as a result, it has historical significance for connecting the First Nations communities in the Northeast. It's also a beautiful canoeing river. So a little more on the St. Croix watershed. Most of this stems from their website and my knowledge of the organization. I believe Abby Pond may be on the webinar. She's currently the executive director of the St. Croix International Waterway Commission and can certainly speak to that organization in a lot more detail than I can at this point. But what I wanted to do with the next 3 slides is to highlight some of the key activities of these groups and the way that they are engaging communities to support their overall mandate. So in the case of the St. Croix, it's an international partnership that protects and enhances the health, heritage, and beauty of a shared waterway. And as I noted in the previous slide, they actually have a management plan that has been adopted by both governments, the one in Maine and the one in New Brunswick, that drives a lot of their work, essentially their action planning on a year-over-year basis, and that allows them to pursue areas of concern, water quality and recreation. Natural and cultural heritage is a big part of the St. Croix, as it is with any other waterway in this part of the world. Fish passage, they've certainly had a lot of success in this field over the last number of years, and it's been a long campaign on that front, a 20-year effort more or less, I think, to open some dams on the system to allow for passage of the alewives. Certainly important from a fisheries perspective, but more important from a nutrient management, nutrient flow perspective within that system. And over the last number of years, I guess last 2 years, that run has been allowed to occur more or less unhindered, which is a significant change over the situation for the previous 20 or so years. Important to note that the St. Croix is a Canadian heritage river, and in the U.S. is noted as an outstanding river. These designations, at least as far as the Canadian Heritage River is concerned, do not bring new rules and regulations with them, but celebrate and recognize the uniqueness of that river to Canada's river heritage. And it is a tool that encourages a greater sense of place or pride of place, shall we say, and can guide activities up and down the river and throughout the system. And all of these contribute to greater awareness and ultimately greater engagement in the stewardship of the resource. One of the strengths of the St. Croix International Waterway Commission over the years has been its monitoring programs, which have supported ongoing stewardship activities throughout the system. Lee Sachasky, the founding director of the St. Croix International Waterway Commission, a very strong biology background and understood the importance, as does the current administration of the organization, of the need to monitor the system to understand how it's changing and to provide good science-based data to policymakers and local residents to inform decisions about the river and its subsequent management. The St. Croix obviously has a number, like any, well, I shouldn't say like any, like a good number of rivers in this part of the world, have annual events associated with them that encourage people, partners, businesses, agencies, and others to get out and enjoy the landscape. And the St. Croix is a wonderful canoeing river for anybody who is an avid canoeer. You definitely want to check out the St. Croix, and you'll be astonished at the number of people, old and young, that are out there fishing and enjoying the river. And I think for me that's a big part of our ability to engage people is to have a river that is usable, that is accessible, and they are engaging and interacting with nature and one another. Subsequently, they take a greater interest in the river and are willing to support groups like the St. Croix International Waterway Commission and others in the ongoing stewardship of that resource. So the Maduxnikeg watershed, this one's a little more close to home for me. I've been working with the Maduxnikeg River Association for the past decade or so on a full-time and part-time basis. And I've included this as an example of transboundary engagement because there's been an ongoing relationship between the tribe, the Holton Band of Maliseets, and the Maduxnikeg River Association, as well as municipalities and others, because these groups and the individuals that they represent are concerned about the overall health of the watershed. And unlike the St. Croix, there is no formal management agreement in place for the Maduxnikeg. It simply has been a matter of individuals coming together and recognizing that the watershed, doesn't recognize an international boundary. Surprise, surprise. That watershed actually does start in Maine, and what happens in Maine has a bearing on water quality and other aspects of the river in New Brunswick, and vice versa. And it's beholden on us as stewards of the resource to look at the whole picture. And so despite there being no formal management agreement in place, a number of parties over the years have recognized the need to collaborate on various efforts that have included significant engagement components to bring a greater awareness to the whole watershed and the need to look at the whole watershed. And I've just briefly here highlighted a couple of efforts that have so far been watershed-wide, a culvert study, so ultimately talking about fish passage within the whole system, and it's always interesting when you're dealing with these transboundary watersheds, and you start down, say, a research project. Methodologies and historical ways of collecting data and numerous other factors come into play that would not normally come into play with a research project that is just in one jurisdiction. So it does add some layer of complexity to a project, but at the end of the day, the ability to show what is happening throughout the whole watershed is of importance to all involved and the broader community, and it's certainly something that we have, I think, at times struggled to bring awareness to, and it's unfortunate. Often public and federal agencies aren't interested in what is happening on the other side of the boundary. For them, from a jurisdictional perspective, the river starts at the boundary, and well, yeah, obviously there's something above it, but it's not of concern to them. And anybody who has spent any time on a river or working with a watershed knows that that's just total bunk. That rivers are that they transcend boundaries. They were there a long time before the boundary, and so we do need to take a holistic approach to their management and engaging communities, partners, and actors and others on both sides of the boundary to ensure that the system is managed and functioning in a holistic fashion. I think there's a really interesting, just on the third point here, there's a really interesting opportunity that is emerging thanks to the Holton Band of Maliseet Indians pursuing over 10 years a partnership with the Army Corps of Engineers to undertake a salmonoid habitat restoration plan that will be watershed-wide. They have come finally, signed off on the paperwork and are coming to the table to undertake a project that is funded for the whole Madaxnikeg watershed, and this is certainly a first in New Brunswick along the main New Brunswick border, and I would suspect even farther afield than that. And so to have the tribe leading this effort with their counterpart in New Brunswick, the Maliseet Nation Conservation Council, is really promising, and certainly excited about the opportunity that this presents to undertake a project that will provide a whole watershed analysis and the development of a restoration plan, habitat restoration plan for the salmonoids. Also delighted that the Atlantic Salmon Conservation Foundation has recently approved some funding to this project as part of their granting program, which is absolutely fantastic. And just a couple of points on the pictures below. I mean, both organizations are interested in protecting the unique habitats and environments of the Madaxnikeg River, and on the left there we have one of the preserves of the Madaxnikeg River Association. That organization currently has protected close to 800 acres of unique habitat, most of it along the main stem of the Madaxnikeg, and the hope over the long term is to be able to grow that across the line, so to speak, and to take more of a whole watershed approach to it. And second photo is linked with the environmental education programming that both organizations are involved in. And then we have some beautiful spring flowers, which I'm afraid are still under snow at this point, but hopefully will be emerging shortly. So the first two, engagement perspective and on a scale perspective, I think one would consider local and small. The St. John is at the complete opposite end of the spectrum. It is big, unwieldy, messy, and just generally disconnected, and you can really sort of see that from my commentary on this slide. Obviously multi-jurisdictional. It's two provinces, Quebec and New Brunswick, and one state, but also two federal governments, Canada and the U.S. And I note that it's a large and complex system that has historically been managed by default with little coordination between the jurisdictions. The IJC has been active on this system in the past, and there was the St. John River Basin Management Committee, which was active in the early to mid 70s. But really, this system has not benefited from a coordinated approach from a management perspective. And apart from small examples like the Maduxna-Keg, there has been very little interaction across the boundary, and the same is occurring in the north between New Brunswick and Quebec, which is really a bit astonishing, sort of given that it is the same country, but at the same time provincial government agencies and federal agencies have varying mandates, and if there's no common ground, well then often there's no reason to be interacting and engaging public and other actors in activities that support the river. So at this point, I'm going to speak a bit more about my work right now with the World Wildlife Fund of Canada on the St. John. It really is around river health and developing an action plan that supports this, and I think our role here, my role here, is as a catalyst, as a facilitator, as a convener. It's somebody that is stepping into the situation well aware of some of the significant disconnects and trying to encourage some of the many good things that are happening to happen more, and there's numerous examples of this. The work of the watershed groups, the work of municipalities, and the work of industry is very good in a lot of instances. We've done a very poor job of telling the stories of those successes, and as a result there has been very little replication of those good projects that support river health and other objectives for the various organizations and agencies that have been involved. And I think it's always a good thing to build on the positive within a system, and this is a good way of doing that. It's an opportunity for us to collectively pursue a healthier St. John River, and do so, yes, with some new techniques in some instances, but in a lot of instances sharing our experiences that we've already had and building out from there. Our work on the St. John River is coming out of, or is informed, I guess is the better way of putting it, by the Canadian Rivers Institute State of the Environment Report. This was a compendium that was compiled in 2011 that summarized some 100+ research projects completed by the Canadian Rivers Institute along the St. John over the last decade, along with historical data and other research efforts. And it has certainly raised the bar and the level of understanding about this large and complex system, and it has provided an engagement opportunity for municipalities, for industry, for First Nations and other actors to move upon. And certainly for WWF, it's useful to have that science piece in place. We are a science-based organization, and our ability to encourage activities and actions that support river health or a healthy St. John River are informed by the work of groups like the Canadian Rivers Institute. Oops, how did that happen? Interesting. Shouldn't hit that button. Sorry about that, folks. Alrighty, back to my slide deck. Took a bit of a side trip there. Sorry about that. Slide number 10 here. So the next two slides really capture, I think, where the situation is on the St. John as far as engagement. These are results from a joint research project between Brock University and the World Wildlife Fund of Canada under the umbrella of what's called social ecological inventory, the purpose of which is to identify who is doing what and where as it relates to river health on the St. John. Prior to this research being completed, myself, provincial, federal agencies, other actors in the system had some sense of what was happening on the St. John, but had no real empirical data to highlight what was actually happening and who was doing what and where as it related to river health. So the social ecological inventory provided us with the empirical data to better understand how this system is functioning, how people are engaging with it, and the diversity of activities that are happening across this rather broad, large landscape. So in this slide here, you can see that there are a diversity of activities occurring throughout the watershed, and these activities are being undertaken by a fairly broad cross-section of actors throughout the region. We took a whole watershed approach to the social ecological inventory, which was unique. That had never been undertaken before with that methodology, and the results have been really quite astonishing. There was some 160 unique organizations that were identified as having an interest in river health, and that represented some 194 individuals that were tied to those specific organizations, and it resulted in this graph, which shows that activities like riparian land management, outreach and education, research and other information gathering are of significant importance to a diversity of the actors throughout the system. And it's important to understand this because in order to engage those actors and others in a more broad discussion about river health, we need to understand what their current level of engagement and activity is around the idea. The next slide, I'm afraid, is a bit of a mess. This is called a social network analysis, and this was completed for the St. John River as part of the social ecological inventory. And so just as a bit of explanation here, the red squares represent groups or actors that were identified and subsequently interviewed as part of the research project. The gray squares represent actors that were identified as part of the research project, but for one reason or another were unable to complete the survey to inform the research project. And the blue squares are actors that were identified by the folks that did participate in the survey, so the red squares, as also being actors that are interested in river health. Social network analysis is a way of identifying the connections and the level of connectivity between various actors within a given system or realm. So in this instance, we were looking at the whole St. John River watershed and trying to better understand who the actors are and what their relationships are to one another when it comes to river health. This obviously informs our work over the coming years and is informative in and of itself because this activity had never been completed before on the St. John. We had a sense of which agencies and actors were interacting with one another, but no empirical data to support that. A couple of points here. On the left hand, I guess it would be the left hand side, there's a red square that's linked to a number of blue squares and gray squares. That red square is an important square because it is what would be considered a bridging organization. It is linking those 7 or 8 other squares to the network. So if we were to lose that red square, that would be a problem, because the thinking would be that those 7 or 8 squares would also lose their connection to the network. So bridging organizations are important. Also interesting to note the clustering or the density of organizations around the center of this social network analysis. That indicates that there is a lot of shared objectives, goals, mandates of organizations, and there's a high level of centrality, which speaks to the first slide that I showed, and that was the one about governance, in that there is a sense of shared responsibility for this watershed, and that's indicated by the level of centrality here. It would be interesting, this is obviously just a snapshot in time from 2013. If we were to look at this in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, it would be interesting to see how the social network analysis changes for the St. John watershed, and what does that mean as far as engagement at a transboundary level, but also at an interprovincial or inter-province level as well. So in summation, just to sort of move towards wrap up here, I've just highlighted a couple of points here about what I think works for engaging communities in water stewardship. Often the top one is the one that most often comes to mind, and that's responding to a crisis and or an identified need. Watershed groups, at least in Eastern Canada, and other actors at the watershed level, fishing game clubs and others, started to come about 20 or so years ago as a result of them recognizing changes within their system, losses of fish population, productivity, that sort of thing, and recognizing the need for local stewardship of the resources. Monitoring is certainly an important one. There's been a lot of success in Maine with the Volunteer Lakes Monitoring Program, which deals not exclusively, sorry, but a significant amount with invasives and water quality, and those programs are active on recreational lakes, so cottagers predominantly, and have had a huge amount of success. Certainly these efforts require sustained support from local actors. They need to be adaptive, and in my experience it's always good to have a champion, a local person or persons, and sometimes that person is rendered in the form of an organization who is the driving force behind the effort through the good, the bad, and sometimes the ugly. So I think to reflect on some of this a bit, there's clearly a transition, not only on the St. John but on the St. Croix and in other watersheds throughout Eastern Canada and across the country, in fact, towards a governance model. Governments are clearly no longer in the place that they are able to monitor and to execute regulations and other policies that support the rivers as people want to see them, and so that's why governance has emerged, and a multitude of actors are assuming greater responsibility for these collective public resources. And a big chunk of this is tied to monitoring and stewardship. This is where people are engaging. Cottagers, residents, and others are engaging at the monitoring and stewardship level, and that's having a significant positive impact on many watersheds across the country. In conclusion, as I was putting my slide deck together the other day, I thought, well, how would I capture all of this? And this was just really my short paragraph synopsis, shall we say, to try and shed a bit more light on what some of the key components are, and I referred to people when I started out. I referred to the connection to the environment. The sense of place has been mentioned, and the level of engagement has also been mentioned, and then obviously having a sustained effort is of significance as we continue to address water situations that are changing on a regular basis. Just put this in here so that you have it for reference on where to find more information. I've mentioned all of these organizations in the presentation today, and here are the links to their websites to find further information. And last, a slide on where you can find me. My coordinates, both email and phone. Always interested in talking with people about my work here, but also about work across the country. So I'd like to thank you for your time today. It's been a real pleasure. This is my first webinar, and looking forward to hearing what folks have to say.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was excellent. Really informative. So much great work that's been done.